October 1972. A hotel in Las Vegas late at night after the show. Cher is standing on a balcony above the strip, still dressed for the stage, looking down. She is 26 years old. She is one half of the most famous married couple in American entertainment. 30 million people watch her on CBS every week. And she is standing on this balcony, dizzy with exhaustion and something worse than exhaustion, trying to do a kind of arithmetic that no one should ever have to do. Whether her 3-year-old daughter could survive without her, whether her mother could survive without her, whether the people who depended on her would be damaged less by her absence than by the thing she was about to go back downstairs and keep pretending to be. Below her, the casino lights pulse. Above her, nothing. She later said she could feel the pull of the empty air. The woman on that balcony was not who America thought she was. The public knew Sonny and Cher, the banter, the costumes, the duet that promised loyalty in 3 words. What the public did not know was that the marriage behind the act had become something Cher would later call involuntary servitude. Her husband was her manager, her employer, and the sole owner of a business built entirely on her talent. This is the story of what the name Sonny and Cher actually cost the woman who made it famous, what it did to the man who built it, and what it left behind for the child who grew up inside it, from a teenage girl's first love, through a 13-year marriage that was really a contract, a divorce that exposed everything, a death that left nothing resolved, and a royalty fight still being waged 50 years later. But that moment on the balcony, the dizziness, the arithmetic of who could survive what, did not arrive out of nowhere. It arrived at the end of a decade of something that had looked to the rest of America like one of the great love stories in popular entertainment. To understand how Cher ended up calculating the cost of disappearing, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the television beginning, not the hit record beginning. The real beginning. A 16-year-old girl walking into a world run by a man 11 years older than she was and mistaking his confidence for safety. This is the story of Sonny and Cher. Not the act, not the theme song, not the costumes or the banter or the weekly spectacle of a marriage performed for 30 million people. This is the story of what the name actually cost the woman who made it famous, what it did to the man who built it, and what it left behind for the child who had no choice in any of it. It stretches across 3 decades of American entertainment, through lawsuits and custody battles and royalty disputes that are still being litigated in the 21st century, and it begins in a place far less glamorous than a CBS soundstage. It begins with 2 people who needed very different things from each other and spent 13 years pretending those needs were the same. The public version came first, and it came loud. By 1965, Sonny and Cher were one of the most recognizable couples in American popular music. I Got You, Babe spent 3 weeks at #1 that August, and the image it projected, the lanky, mustachioed man and the impossibly cool young woman in bell-bottoms, singing a promise of loyalty into each other's faces, became a kind of shorthand for romantic authenticity in the age of the British invasion. They were different, they were weird, they looked like they had built their own world and then invited the public in to watch. That was the selling proposition, and it worked. By the early 70s, after the recording career had cooled and the nightclub circuit had rebuilt their visibility, television made them permanent. The Sonny and Cher Comedy Hour debuted on CBS in 1971, climbed into the top 20, and fixed the couple in American memory not merely as recording artists, but as a branded domestic unit. A marriage turned into weekly entertainment with the teasing, the costumes, the patter, and the unspoken assurance that what the audience was watching was, on some level, real. That was the version America believed. The private version required a different kind of attention. Cheryl Sarkisian was born on May 20th, 1946, in El Centro, California, a small desert city near the Mexican border that offered almost nothing of the life she would later inhabit. Her mother, Georgia Holt, was a singer and actress who never quite made it, a woman of considerable beauty and marginal stability who would eventually marry 8 times, cycling through husbands, the way other people cycled through apartments. Her father, John Sarkisian, was an Armenian-American truck driver with a gambling problem who was largely absent from her childhood. The household moved frequently. Money was scarce, then briefly available, then scarce again. Cher later described a girlhood defined not by cruelty but by inconsistency. The particular kind of childhood where you learn early that the adults around you are unreliable, that the ground can shift without warning, and that the safest thing you can do is make yourself useful enough that someone decides to keep you around. She was dyslexic, though the diagnosis would not come until much later. She struggled in school. She was tall, dark haired, striking in a way that did not conform to the blonde California ideal, and possessed of a voice that, even as a teenager, had the deep, distinctive quality that would later become unmistakable. What she wanted, and this is essential to understanding everything that followed, was not fame in the abstract. She wanted belonging. She wanted a world that felt organized. She wanted someone to look at her and say, "You are the center of this." The hunger for that was not vanity. It was the specific longing of a child who had grown up watching the center collapse over and over again. Salvatore Philip Bono was born on February 16th, 1935, in Detroit, Michigan, the son of Italian immigrants. His family moved to the Los Angeles area when he was young, and he grew up in Inglewood, working class and ambitious in the way that certain men in mid century Los Angeles understood ambition, not as inspiration, but as mechanics. How do you get from where you are to where the money is? Sonny figured it out by working the edges of the music industry. He took a job at a recording studio. He wrote songs. He made himself useful to Phil Spector, the most important and most terrifying producer in American pop music, and learned the architecture of the business from the inside. How publishing rights worked, how contracts were structured, who actually got paid when a record sold, and how the difference between the person whose name was on the label and the person whose name was on the bank account could be the difference between wealth and dependence. He was not a great singer. He knew that. He was not a virtuoso musician. He knew that too. What Sonny Bono understood better than almost anyone around him was that talent was only one variable in the entertainment equation, and frequently not the most important one. Control was the variable that mattered. If you controlled the publishing, the management, the bookings, the corporate structure, and the terms under which the talent operated, you did not need to be the most talented person in the room. You just needed to be the person who decided how the room worked. He was 27 years old when he met Cher. She was 16. That age difference matters, not because it explains everything, but because it established the terms of everything. He already knew the business. She did not know anything about the business. He had been married once and divorced. She had never been in a serious relationship. He understood contracts, leverage, and the mechanics of control. She understood loneliness, instability, and the desperate appeal of a person who seemed to know exactly what he was doing. Cher's later recollections describe him as funny, energetic, seductive in his ambition, and capable of making a chaotic life feel suddenly manageable. He was the first man in her life who offered direction rather than dysfunction. That he offered it by becoming the person who directed everything: her career, her money, her daily schedule, eventually her entire identity as a public figure, was a distinction she would not fully grasp for more than a decade. There is something about that detail worth sitting with for a moment. A 16-year-old girl meets a 27-year-old man in the music business. He is not famous yet, neither is she, but he already knows the architecture of the industry. Who gets paid, how contracts work, where the power sits. She knows none of that. What she knows is that he pays attention to her, that he has plans, and that his plans include her. For a girl who had grown up watching her mother cycle through marriages and move from apartment to apartment, the simple fact of being included in someone's plan was enough. That is the emotional trap at the center of this story. Sonny did not arrive in Cher's life only as a romantic figure. He arrived as structure. And structure, for someone who had never had it, can be almost impossible to distinguish from love. They moved in together. The arrangement, at least initially, was not romantic, or so the story was later told. Sonny positioned himself as a protector, an older friend, someone who could offer a teenage girl a place to live and a connection to the music world without the complications of a sexual relationship. Now, whether that framing was ever entirely accurate is a question only two people could answer, and one of them is dead. What is clear is that the dynamic, from its earliest days, was organized around his authority and her gratitude. He decided what they worked on. He decided who they met. He decided how the partnership functioned. And the word partnership is generous because the 16-year-old girl was not negotiating terms. She was being given a life. And the price of the life was that someone else got to design it. They became a couple. They became an act. And then, with a speed that still seems remarkable, they became famous. I Got You, Babe turned them into a national sensation in the summer of 1965, and the image was fixed. Sonny, the short, scrappy, lovable goofball. Cher, the tall, stunning, deadpan beauty who seemed to tolerate him with a mixture of affection and bemusement. The act was built on the idea that they were an unlikely pair who worked because the chemistry was genuine. And for a time, the chemistry was genuine enough to sell records, fill concert halls, and sustain the early illusion that what the audience was watching was a partnership between equals. But the first hints of what the private reality looked like arrived early, before the television empire, before the biggest fame, before the structure became fully visible. Cher's memoir accounts include an incident from their early days together, a moment in a house they shared in Los Angeles, shortly after Sonny's first divorce, when a puppy got underfoot and Sonny shoved it aside roughly. Cher reprimanded him. His response, by her later account, was to push her against a wall. It was not a punch. It was not a prolonged assault. It was the kind of physical intimidation that lands just short of what most people would call violence. And that is precisely what made it so effective as a tool of control. It communicated a boundary. It communicated hierarchy. It communicated in a language older than any recording contract who was in charge of this household and what happened when that authority was questioned. Cher told him that if he ever touched her like that again, she would leave. She meant it. She also did not leave. She was young. She was in what she believed was love. And the machinery of their shared life was already in motion. The bookings, the recordings, the costumes, the promotional appearances, the entire apparatus of a career that was being built around both their names, but managed entirely by one of them. Leaving Sonny, even then, would have meant dismantling the only professional structure she had ever known. And so the incident and the puppy, the wall, the warning, receded into the background noise of a life that was getting louder by the month. The success, when it arrived in its television form, was genuinely extraordinary. The Sonny and Cher Comedy Hour was not merely a show. It was a weekly industrial operation that monetized a marriage. Every episode required rehearsals at CBS Television City in Hollywood, costume fittings that could take hours, script conferences where the banter was planned down to the beat, musical arrangements, guest star coordination, and the careful maintenance of an on-screen dynamic that depended entirely on the audience believing the couple was happy. The studio lights came up, the cue cards appeared. The audience laughed at dialogue that read today sounds less like flirtation between equals and more like a rehearsal for the roles they actually occupied. The fool and the beauty, the schemer and the asset, the man who ran things and the woman who made them worth watching. Behind the cameras, Sonny was not playing the fool at all. He was the producer. He was the manager. He was the business operator. He was the person who decided what the act did, where it performed, how much it charged, and where the revenue went afterward. The show's success had turned the Bono household into something that no longer resembled a home in any ordinary sense. There were meetings with network executives, negotiations with talent agencies, legal consultations about syndication rights, and through all of it, Sonny sat at the center of the machinery, making decisions that affected Cher's career, Cher's finances, and Cher's daily schedule, and making them without consulting her. The arrangement operated on the assumption that had been established when she was 16. He knew the business, and she did not, and therefore he would handle things. The fact that she was now the single most marketable element of the entire operation, that the show's ratings were driven substantially by her presence, her comic timing, her musical performances, her costumes, and the particular quality of magnetic watchability that no amount of producing could manufacture, did not alter the power structure. She was the reason the machine worked. He was the person who owned the machine. By Cher's later account, he created a corporate entity called Cher Enterprises, a name that suggested she owned something meaningful, and structured it so that he maintained control and she had no real ownership stake. She later described learning that she was, in effect, an employee of a company that bore her own name. The details of the financial arrangement have been reported in varying terms across different sources, but the central fact is consistent and well documented. Cher did not control the earnings generated by the image that depended entirely on her face, her voice, her talent, and her labor. She was the product, he was the owner. And the gap between those two positions was something she did not fully comprehend until years had passed, because the lifestyle, the houses, the clothes, the glamour, the visible apparatus of wealth, created the illusion of shared prosperity while concealing the reality of lopsided power. Their daughter, Chastity, born March 4th, 1969, and later known as Chaz Bono, arrived just before the television peak, which meant the child was folded into the career mythology almost from infancy. By the age of 2, Chaz was appearing on the show, brought out in front of the studio audience as part of the family spectacle. The public saw an adorable toddler being held by famous parents on a brightly lit set. What they were actually watching was a child being incorporated into a branded entertainment unit before having any language for what that meant. The household operated on the rhythms of production, not the rhythms of family life. Taping schedules dictated evenings. Promotional commitments consumed weekends. The ordinary architecture of childhood, meals at a regular hour, bedtimes that held, the slow accumulation of routine that teaches a small person the world is stable, was subordinate to the demands of a weekly variety show that devoured every room it entered. Chaz would grow up to describe a childhood defined by public exposure, private confusion, and the strange inheritance of being famous before being old enough to understand what fame required you to give up. Beneath the construction, the cracks were spreading in directions the audience could not see. Cher's later accounts describe not a single affair but a pattern of infidelity on Sonny's part that ran through the marriage like a parallel career. Ongoing, managed, and treated by him as something separate from the partnership, as though his romantic life and his business life operated under different rules. The discovery she later identified as one of the most devastating came during the period around a third miscarriage in roughly 1967, when she learned Sonny had been involved with his secretary. The timing is important. A woman who had just lost a pregnancy discovered that her husband's attention was not merely elsewhere, but specifically directed at someone inside their shared professional orbit. Someone who worked in the same office, answered the same phone, existed within the daily machinery of the act. The cruelty was not incidental, it was structural. Sonny's infidelity was not happening despite the marriage. It was happening inside the apparatus he had built around it, in the spaces where Cher was supposed to be the only woman who mattered. And the miscarriages, 3 of them, by her account, across a period when the public saw only glamour and success, added a dimension of grief that the audience never knew about. The woman singing on television every week, the woman whose smile was selling a product called domestic happiness, was privately mourning pregnancies that did not survive and processing the knowledge that her husband's attention had wandered precisely when she needed it most. The gap between the public image and the private reality was not a crack at this point. It was a chasm, and Cher was standing on one side of it, performing joy, while living something that looked nothing like joy at all. And still the show went on. That is the part of this story that requires the most patience to understand, because from the outside it makes no sense. Why did she stay? The answer is not simple, and reducing it to weakness or naivety would be a disservice to the intelligence of a woman who would later prove herself one of the most formidable survivors in American entertainment. She stayed because the marriage and the career were the same structure, and leaving one meant losing the other. She stayed because she had entered the arrangement at 16 and had never known professional life outside of Sonny's management. She stayed because there was a child. She stayed because the financial architecture of her own success was opaque to her. And leaving without understanding what she was owed meant potentially walking away from everything she had helped build. And she stayed because the public loved the act, and the act required 2 people who appeared to love each other. And the pressure to maintain that appearance was applied not just by Sonny, but by the network, the sponsors, the agents, the entire ecosystem of people whose livelihoods depended on the Sonny and Cher brand continuing to function. The first fracture, the moment the private reality could no longer be absorbed as background noise, arrived not as a single dramatic scene, but as a recognition that accumulated across conversations, silences, and finally one question: that could not be answered. Cher later described a conversation with David Geffen, the music executive who had become a friend and confidant, in which he asked her something straightforward. How was she paid? She could not answer, not because the question was unfair or the answer complicated, but because she had never been given the information. The money generated by the act, the television contracts, the performance fees, the recording royalties, the merchandising, flowed into structures that Sonny controlled, and what came back to Cher was a lifestyle. She had houses, she had clothes, she had the visible apparatus of wealth, but she did not have ownership. She did not have equity. She did not have a clear understanding of what her own labor was worth or where the proceeds of that labor had gone. She was, in the most literal sense, a woman who could not explain her own financial life because the man who managed it had never given her the tools to understand it. That conversation changed the terms of everything. Cher was no longer asking whether the marriage was fixable as a romantic partnership. She was asking a different question entirely, a question that connected her experience to something larger and older than one bad marriage in the entertainment business. When she called Lucille Ball for advice, the call carried a weight that went far beyond celebrity friendship. Ball understood, in a way that almost no one else in American entertainment could, what it meant to be a woman whose marriage had been fused to a television product and whose enormous talent had been administered by a husband who functioned simultaneously as romantic partner, business manager, and gatekeeper. Ball had lived through it with Desi Arnaz. She knew the architecture from the inside. She knew what the walls were made of. And she knew from painful experience what leaving looked like when the marriage was not just a marriage, but a corporation, a brand, a weekly obligation to millions of viewers, and a legal and financial structure that had been designed, whether consciously or not, to make departure as costly as possible. What Ball told Cher has never been fully reported in public accounts. What matters more than the specific words is the fact of the call itself, the recognition it represented. Cher had reached a point where she needed to hear from someone who had survived the same trap. She was not calling to ask whether to stay. She was calling to ask how a woman leaves a man when leaving means exiting an entire system, a television contract, a corporate entity, a custody arrangement, a public identity, and a financial architecture built so thoroughly around one person's control that even the most famous woman in the act could not explain how her own money worked. Cher now understood the shape of what she was inside. It was not a marriage in any meaningful sense. It was an arrangement in which her name, her image, her earning power, her schedule, and her daily existence were administered by the person she would need to fight in order to leave. The marriage license and the business structure were functionally the same document, and tearing up one meant going to war over the other. Her daughter was 4 years old. The television show was pulling top 20 ratings. America still believed in the love story. And behind all of it, and behind the sequins and the cue cards and the weekly spectacle of performed intimacy, a woman who had entered this arrangement at 16 was only now in her mid-20s, beginning to understand what she had never been told, that the enterprise bearing her name had been built so that her talent was the most valuable thing inside it and her power was the least. She had spent a decade making Sonny Bono rich and famous, and she did not own a meaningful piece of any of it. The marriage was not a partnership, it was a company, and she had just discovered that she was not a partner, she was the product. If you're finding this story as compelling as I do, take a moment to subscribe. There is so much more to this family that the public never saw, and we're just getting started. Understanding the trap and escaping it were not the same thing. Cher knew now what the arrangement was. She knew the corporate structure favored Sonny. She knew the money flowed through channels she could not see or control. She knew the marriage had become a workplace organized entirely around her labor and his authority. What she did not yet have was a plan for getting out. Because getting out of Sonny Bono's world meant fighting on every front simultaneously. It meant a divorce. It meant a custody battle over a daughter who was already a public figure at the age of 4. It meant a legal confrontation over business entities she barely understood. It meant walking away from a television show that was still generating enormous revenue and enormous public affection. And it meant doing all of this while the man she was leaving controlled every piece of the infrastructure that her professional life depended on: the bookings, the management, the contracts, the corporate accounts, the relationships with agents and network executives that had all been rooted through him for more than 10 years. Cher was not simply a woman thinking about leaving her husband. She was an employee contemplating a departure from a company that did not have an exit clause, and the company's name was her own. The escalation did not happen all at once. It happened across months and then years, a slow tightening in which Cher's growing awareness of the power imbalance collided, repeatedly and without resolution, with Sonny's determination to maintain it. The emotional deterioration had been underway for so long that what changed was not the deterioration itself, but Cher's willingness to stop absorbing it quietly. The marriage was loveless by her later account, not volatile in the way of screaming fights and thrown dishes, but empty in the way of two people sharing a house, a television set, a child, and a weekly national audience while occupying entirely separate emotional realities. Sonny continued to see other women. Cher continued to perform the role of devoted wife on camera. The show continued to air on CBS, and the distance between the woman the audience saw on screen every week, the funny, sharp, gorgeous, apparently an effortless command of everything around her, and the woman who existed behind the cameras grew wider. With every taping, every rehearsal, every forced smile, every scripted line of banter that required her to pretend, this man was her partner when she now understood he was her boss. The control Sonny exercised was not limited to the financial architecture. It extended into the social fabric of their daily lives in ways that were difficult to see from the outside, but suffocating from the inside. By Cher's later account, he managed who they socialized with, what information reached her about the business, how their schedule was organized, and what decisions were made about the family's domestic existence, from what they ate to where they traveled to which phone calls she received and which she did not. He positioned himself as the central hub through which all communication and all decision making flowed, so that Cher's relationship with the outside world was mediated almost entirely through him. She did not have her own business manager. She did not have her own lawyer. She did not have relationships with the network executives or the booking agents that existed independently of Sonny's management of those relationships. Every thread of her professional life, and increasingly her personal life, ran through the same man. And that man had a financial interest in ensuring she never developed the independent connections that would make leaving possible. The effect of this kind of pervasive management is difficult to convey to someone who has not experienced it because it does not announce itself as domination. It presents itself as competence. It presents itself as the person who handles things, the person who knows best, the person who takes care of the details so you do not have to worry. And when you have entered the arrangement at 16 and have spent your entire adult life inside it and have never known what it feels like to make your own professional or financial decisions, the line between being taken care of and being controlled can remain invisible for years. It had remained invisible to Cher for more than a decade. Now that she could see it, it was everywhere. In the contracts she had never read, in the accounts she had never accessed, in the meetings she had never been invited to, in the decisions that were presented to her as already made. Cher later used language that carried deliberate legal and historical weight to describe this period. She called the arrangement involuntary servitude. The phrase was not chosen for dramatic effect. It was chosen because it described, in her assessment, the lived experience of a woman who could not leave a working arrangement she had never consented to on fully informed terms, who could not access or control the earnings generated by her own talent, and whose daily life was organized by decisions made entirely by someone else. Whether the legal system would formally agree with that characterization is a question that belongs to lawyers. What matters for this story is that Cher experienced the marriage by this point in the early 70s not as a disappointing relationship, but as a form of captivity. One that happened to take place inside beautiful houses, inside Bob Mackie gowns, inside a CBS soundstage where the captive was expected to be the most entertaining person in the room. The child absorbed what children always absorb in these situations, not the specific facts which were beyond a 4-year-old's or 5-year-old's comprehension, but the atmospheric pressure. Chaz was growing up inside a household where the adults smiled on camera and were silent at home, where the rhythms of life were determined not by the child's needs, but by the television schedule, and where the tension between the parents expressed itself not in obvious conflict, but in a kind of pervasive emotional weather that a small person could feel without being able to name. Chaz had been on television since the age of 2. The child knew in the pre-verbal way that children know things, that home and performance were not separate worlds. They were the same world, and the rules of one lead constantly into the other. That knowledge that the public face and the private face are different, that love can be performed, that the family the world sees is not the family you live in, would become the defining inheritance of Chaz's childhood. It was not money, it was not fame. It was the understanding, absorbed before language, that appearances are a job. In the early months of 1972, Cher made a decision that was equal parts escape attempt and act of desperation. She left. Not through lawyers, not with a negotiated separation, not with a custody arrangement or a financial plan or even a clear destination. She left with a man and a guitarist named Bill, by her later account, and drove north toward San Francisco, away from the machinery of the marriage, away from the television tapings and the costume fittings and the hollow banter, away from the corporate structure of Cher Enterprises, away from Sonny. It was the kind of departure a person makes when the need to be somewhere else, anywhere else, overwhelms the capacity to think strategically about what leaving actually requires. She got in a car with another man and pointed it toward Northern California in the fog. And for a few hours, she was not Cher of Sonny and Cher. She was a woman on a highway trying to outrun a decade. Sonny's response was immediate and entirely characteristic. He did not call her and ask her to come home. He did not sit with the loss and wonder what he had done wrong. He did not consult a marriage counselor or a friend or a priest. He hired private detectives. The investigators were dispatched to follow Cher and the guitarist, to track their movements through the highways and motels of Northern California, to report back on where they went and what they did and who they spoke to. The detail matters not, because private investigators are unusual in bitter separations between wealthy people. They are not, but because of what it reveals about how Sonny understood the situation. He was not responding as a heartbroken husband trying to save a marriage. He was responding as a manager whose most valuable asset had left the premises without authorization. The detectives were not looking for a wife. They were looking for inventory that had gone missing. The San Francisco episode acquired an almost absurdist quality as it unfolded. Cher and Bill driving north through the coastal fog, the landscape turning green and damp after the dry sprawl of Los Angeles. The private detectives somewhere behind them on the highway, trying to maintain surveillance while navigating the same unfamiliar roads and the same fog that was swallowing the taillights ahead of them. Reports later suggested the investigators lost track of their subjects more than once, which means that somewhere between Los Angeles and San Francisco, on a foggy stretch of California highway in 1972, a famous woman fleeing her famous husband was being pursued by hired strangers who could not reliably find her. And back in Los Angeles, Sonny was managing two simultaneous crises: the personal crisis of a wife who had left, and the professional crisis of a television show that still had a production schedule, a network expecting episodes, and an audience that had been promised the spectacle of a happy marriage every week. She came back, not because the situation at home had changed, not because Sonny had recognized what he had done or offered to restructure the arrangement. She came back because the infrastructure of her life, the child she was not willing to abandon, the television contracts she had not yet disentangled herself from, the financial dependence that Sonny's corporate structure had ensured, and the simple fact that she had no independent professional apparatus and no legal strategy for departure, made staying gone impossible without the kind of preparation she had not yet done. The return was not a reconciliation. It was a tactical retreat by a woman who had now tasted the possibility of escape and found that the taste, however briefly it lasted, was better than anything the marriage had offered in years. The months that followed were the darkest of the marriage. Cher was physically present inside the arrangement, but psychologically already departed, performing the role of wife and co-star on the CBS soundstage while privately assembling the courage and the information she would need to leave permanently And it was during this period, in October of 1972 in Las Vegas, at a hotel where the act was performing one of its lucrative casino engagements, that she reached the lowest point. The audience who encountered this story at its opening already knows the scene. The balcony, the height, the city glowing below, the dizziness she later described, the terrible arithmetic of a woman trying to calculate whether the people who loved her could survive her absence. The moment was not melodrama. It was not a performance. It was the psychological cost, rendered in vertigo and exhaustion, of an arrangement that had taken a woman of extraordinary talent and charisma and compressed her into someone standing alone above a desert city, trying to decide whether the world was survivable. She stepped back, she got dressed, she went downstairs into the casino bright, artificial glamour of the hotel and performed. That act of continuation, going back to the machine, going back to the rehearsals and the costume changes and the stage lights and the scripted laughter, carrying the private knowledge of what she had just considered, may be the single most revealing detail in the entire story. Because it shows what the structure demanded of her. Not just talent, not just beauty, not just comic timing. It demanded that she metabolize her own despair and convert it into entertainment night after night, week after week until the machinery could be stopped. The institutions around the couple offered no help. CBS wanted the show to continue because the show made money. The agents wanted the bookings to continue because the bookings generated commissions. The lawyers, at least initially, operated within a framework that respected the structures Sonny had created rather than questioning how or why they had been created. Friends may have offered private sympathy. Private sympathy does not dismantle a corporate entity. The only voice that cut through the institutional noise was Lucille Ball's. Not because Ball offered a legal strategy, but because she offered the most valuable thing a woman in Cher's position could receive: the lived proof that another woman had survived the same trap. Ball had been married to Desi Arnaz. She had watched her own marriage fuse with her television career until the two were indistinguishable. She had been through the separation, the public scrutiny, the professional reconfiguration, and she was still standing. That was the message. Not advice, survival. Cher filed for divorce. The date of the filing and the date of the finalization were separated by months of the kind of prolonged legal process that wealth, fame, and deeply entangled business interest inevitably produce. The proceedings were not amicable. They were conducted through lawyers, through depositions, through financial disclosures that required forensic accountants to trace the flow of revenue through the corporate structures Sonny had built. Every dollar the act had ever earned had to be accounted for. Every contract had to be reviewed. Every entity, Cher Enterprises, the production company, the publishing arrangements, the merchandising deals, had to be valued and its ownership terms determined. The mundane reality of divorcing Sonny Bono was a room full of lawyers and bankers' boxes full of documents. And inside those boxes was the paper trail of a decade in which a woman's talent had generated millions of dollars that she had never been allowed to manage or even fully understand. The custody battle over Chaz became a central front, not only because both parents loved the child, but because custody, in the context of a marriage that had also been a business, carried implications that went beyond parenting. It carried implications about narrative control, about who would be seen by the court and by the public as the wronged party, about who would be positioned as the responsible and stable parent, and who would be characterized as the one who had destabilized the family. Chaz was 6 years old and already the subject of legal briefs and courtroom arguments, already being discussed in terms of best interest and primary residence and visitation schedules by adults whose emotional conflict had long since overwhelmed their capacity to shield a child from its consequences. The little girl who had been carried onto a CBS soundstage at 2 was now being carried metaphorically into a family court where the question was no longer which parent would produce a better television show, but which parent would produce a better childhood. A question that neither the court nor the parents could answer with any certainty. The financial dimensions of the divorce were staggering in their complexity. The corporate structure Sonny had built, Cher Enterprises and whatever other entities existed in the architecture of the act's revenue, had to be valued, divided, or dissolved. The question of what Cher was owed required answering a prior question that the marriage itself had never forced into the open. What was her labor worth? Not her talent in the abstract, but the specific, quantifiable economic contribution of her voice, her face, her screen presence, and her willingness to show up every week and be the reason 30 million people turned on their televisions. Sonny had built the structure. Cher had filled it with everything that made it valuable. The divorce forced both of them to confront, in the language of lawyers and financial disclosures, a truth the marriage had been organized around concealing, that they were not equal partners in any sense, and that the inequality had been designed rather than accidental. The divorce became final on June 26, 1975. Cher was 29 years old, Sonny was 40, Chaz was 6. After 13 years together and 6 years of legal marriage, the document was signed and the union was dissolved. But the legal ending was only one layer of the story. The more significant ending, the one that would define both of their legacies, was the exposure, forced into public view by the financial disclosures and the legal arguments, and the sheer impossibility of keeping the truth contained any longer, of what the marriage had actually been. The proceedings had turned over rocks that Sonny had preferred to leave undisturbed. The corporate structures were now visible. The revenue flows were now documented. The gap between what Cher had earned through her labor and what Cher had been allowed to control was now a matter of court record rather than private suspicion. And the picture that emerged was devastating in its clarity. The most famous marriage in American entertainment had not been a love story at all. It had been a labor arrangement dressed in costume and scripted banter and the illusion of domestic happiness. The legal document ended the marriage. It did not end the entanglement, the resentment, the unresolved financial claims, or the complicated emotional residue of a relationship that had been simultaneously the most important and the most damaging thing in both of their lives. Cher would later speak of Sonny with a mixture of anger and something that was not quite forgiveness, but was not quite its absence either. The particular emotional complexity of a woman who understood that the person who had harmed her most was also the person who had, in some real sense, given her the career that made her independence possible. He had seen her talent before anyone else. He had built the vehicle that made her famous, and he had designed that vehicle so that she could never drive it without his permission. Sonny, for his part, would eventually apologize, not immediately, not not in the raw aftermath of the divorce, when positions were hardened and lawyers were still filing motions, and the wound was too fresh for either of them to speak about it with any distance. The apology came later, years later, and Cher would describe it as genuine, if incomplete, an acknowledgement of what had happened without a full reckoning with all of its implications. There was something almost disorienting about the fact that the two of them, having gone through what they had gone through, could find their way to a conversation that contained even a partial apology. But that was the nature of the relationship. It resisted simplification. Sonny was not a monster. He was a man who had built a system that served his interests at the expense of the person closest to him, and who had operated within that system for so long that dismantling it felt, to him, like losing everything rather than doing the right thing. That distinction between a villain and a person whose selfishness had systemic consequences is one the story has to hold without collapsing it in either direction. By the time the apology came, Sonny had reinvented himself in ways that no one watching the Comedy Hour in 1972 could have predicted. He had moved into politics, run for mayor of Palm Springs, and eventually won a seat in the United States Congress, bringing to Washington the same instinct for branding and positioning that had built the television empire. The operator who had managed Cher's career would spend his later years managing a political career of his own, and the skills turned out to be more transferable than anyone might have expected. But none of that, not the political reinvention, not the eventual apology, not the passage of years, could undo the fundamental revelation that the divorce had forced into public view. The most famous marriage in American entertainment had not been a love story. It had been a labor arrangement dressed in costume and scripted banter and the illusion of domestic happiness. The woman at the center of it had entered at 16, had been managed and controlled and financially marginalized for more than a decade, and had nearly died, not from violence, but from the accumulated weight of powerlessness, before finding her way out. The man at the center of it had built something extraordinary, and had done it by treating his wife's talent as raw material and his own authority as the refining process. And the child at the center of it, 6 years old on the day the divorce was finalized, already famous, already publicly identified, already carrying a name that meant something to millions of strangers, was only beginning to discover what it meant to inherit not money or fame, but the wreckage of two people who had confused a marriage with a corporation and had broken both in the process of separating them. The marriage was over on paper. The questions it had raised about ownership, about labor, about the nature of a partnership that had never truly been one, were not. Who owned the songs? Who owned the image? Who owed what to whom, and for how long? Cher was free. She was also, for the first time since the age of 16, entirely responsible for her own life. A life she would have to build from scratch, without the structure that had simultaneously elevated and imprisoned her. Sonny still held pieces of the empire. The child was growing up between two households, two narratives, and two parents whose relationship would never fully resolve into either friendship or complete estrangement. And the royalties from I Got You Babe and the other songs that had made the name famous were still generating money. Money that would be fought over, litigated, and contested for decades to come, long after the marriage that produced them had been reduced to legal documents and competing memories. What Cher did with her freedom is one of the great reinvention stories in American entertainment, and it began not with triumph, but with turbulence. Within weeks of the divorce becoming final, she married Greg Allman, the Southern rock musician from the Allman Brothers Band, a union so sudden and so seemingly impulsive that it startled even the people closest to her. If the marriage to Sonny had been defined by control, the marriage to Allman was defined by chaos. Allman was a gifted musician with deep and well-documented struggles with heroin and alcohol, a man whose talent was enormous and whose capacity for stable domestic life was essentially non-existent. Cher filed for divorce from Allman just 9 days after the wedding. They reconciled. They separated again. The marriage produced a son, Elijah Blue Allman, born in July of 1976 and eventually ended in divorce in 1979. The pattern, attraction to charismatic, complicated men who offered intensity rather than safety, followed by the discovery that intensity and reliability were fundamentally different qualities, was one Cher would later acknowledge with the rueful clarity of a woman who understood her own history well enough to name it without pretending she had been above it. She had spent her formative years inside a structure built by a controlling man who offered certainty in exchange for obedience. The impulse to escape that structure was healthy. The impulse to replace it immediately with something equally consuming was not. She was learning, in her late 20s and early 30s, the basic skills of independent adult life that most people develop a decade earlier. How to choose a partner without confusing need for love. How to manage money without deferring to someone else. How to exist in the world as a person rather than as a component of someone else's enterprise. But the career that emerged from the wreckage of the Sonny years was something remarkable. Freed from the management apparatus that had defined her professional life since the age of 16, Cher began making her own decisions about what music to record, what television to appear on, who to collaborate with, and how to present herself to the public. The results were uneven at first, as they often are when a person's learning to operate machinery they have never been permitted to touch. She hosted her own television variety show, which did not achieve the ratings of the Comedy Hour. She took guest spots in television specials. She moved through the late 70s and into the 80s with the particular determination of someone who had something to prove not just to the entertainment industry but to herself. That she could exist and succeed and matter and generate her own income and control her own schedule without the name Sonny Bono attached to hers. The acting career became the vehicle for the most definitive proof of what had always been true and what Sonny's management structure had obscured. Cher was not a television personality who happened to sing. She was a performer of genuine, extraordinary range. The Comedy Hour had confined her to a specific register: the beautiful straight woman, the deadpan foil, the singer in spectacular Bob Mackie gowns. When she began pursuing dramatic roles in the early 1980s, the entertainment industry discovered what the variety show format had never allowed the public to see. She could act. Not adequately, not as a celebrity dabbling in a second career for the novelty of it. She could genuinely, commandingly, memorably act. The turning point came with Silkwood in 1983, directed by Mike Nichols, a film about the nuclear industry whistleblower Karen Silkwood. Cher played the role of Dolly Pellicker, a factory worker and lesbian, a part that required none of the glamour the public associated with her name, and all of the emotional intelligence they had never been given the opportunity to witness. She was raw in the role, she was specific. She disappeared into the character in a way that made critics and audiences reconsider everything they thought they knew about what she was capable of. She received an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress. The industry took notice. The public, which had spent years thinking of her primarily as half of a defunct television marriage, began to understand that the woman they had been watching was considerably more talented than the format she had been working in. The roles continued. The Witches of Eastwick in 1987, opposite Jack Nicholson, Suspect the same year. And then Moonstruck, also in 1987, Norman Jewison's romantic comedy set in the Italian-American community of Brooklyn, in which Cher played Loretta Castorini, a widowed bookkeeper who falls in love with her fiancé's younger brother. The performance was warm, funny, grounded, and completely in command. A woman playing a woman who was figuring out, at middle age, what she actually wanted from life. And the resonance between the character's journey and Cher's own biography was impossible to miss, even if no one on screen acknowledged it. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress. The Oscar night was, for anyone paying attention to the full arc of this story, something considerably more significant than a career milestone or a celebrity triumph. It was the complete and public dismantling of the premise that Sonny's management empire had been built on. The assumption that Cher's talent required his structure to function, that she could not succeed independently, that the machinery he had designed and controlled was the reason she was famous, rather than something that had been parasitically attached to a talent that existed independently of everything he had built around it. She stood on the stage at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in Los Angeles, holding the gold statuette, wearing a gown that was pure Cher, dramatic, unapologetic, designed to be stared at. And the image was the exact opposite of the woman who had stood on a hotel balcony in Las Vegas 15 years earlier, calculating whether the world was survivable. She had survived it. She had done more than survive it. She had become, entirely on her own terms and under her own name, one of the most acclaimed and most successful performers in the country. The music career reinvented itself too, with the kind of defiant longevity that most artists never achieve. In the late 80s and through the 90s, Cher continued to record and tour, refusing to accept the conventional wisdom that women in popular music had an expiration date. The most spectacular proof of this refusal came in 1998 with the release of Believe, a dance pop record that used autotune vocal processing in a way no mainstream pop song had before. The distorted, shimmering vocal effect that would later be imitated by hundreds of artists was, in its first prominent deployment, the sound of a 52-year-old woman reinventing herself yet again. The song became a global phenomenon. It reached #1 in more than 20 countries. It was the best-selling single of 1999 in the United Kingdom. It sold more than 11 million copies worldwide. The woman who had once been unable to explain how she was paid was now generating revenue streams that belonged entirely to her, and the scale of that revenue was staggering by any measure. Believe was not merely a hit. It was a statement delivered in 4 minutes of propulsive dance music that the talent Sonny had treated as raw material for his management empire was still producing at a level that dwarfed anything the Sonny and Cher brand had ever generated. The decades that followed only deepened the proof. Cher launched farewell tours that turned out not to be farewell at all. She began a Las Vegas residency at Caesar's Palace that ran for years and grossed hundreds of millions of dollars. A particular irony, given that Las Vegas had even been the city where she had come closest to ending her life during the darkest period of the marriage. The desert city that had once been the setting for her lowest moment became, decades later, the setting for some of her greatest professional triumphs. She performed night after night in front of audiences who had paid substantial money to see a woman in her 60s, then her 70s command a stage with the same authority and presence that had made her unmissable on television at the age of 25. The career that Sonny had built and controlled had lasted a decade. The career that Cher built for herself lasted half a century and counting. Sonny's trajectory after the divorce followed a different arc, but shared the same instinct for self-reinvention that Cher demonstrated in her own career. He remarried, eventually to Mary Whitaker in 1986, his fourth marriage, and settled in Palm Springs, California, where he opened an Italian restaurant called Bono and began involving himself in local politics with the same restless energy and appetite for control that had characterized his entertainment career. The restaurant gave him visibility. Local politics gave him a stage. He ran for mayor of Palm Springs in 1988, then, campaigning with the easy charm and name recognition of a man who had spent decades on national television, and won. He served as mayor until 1992, and the role suited him in the ways that the entertainment business, post-Cher, had not. He was back in charge of something. He was the person making decisions, setting agendas, working the room, managing the brand. The specific domain and the mid-sized California resort city, rather than a CBS variety show priced domes, was different. The operating principles were the same. In 1994, he won election to the United States House of Representatives, representing California's 44th congressional district as a Republican. The entertainer turned politician was not an entirely novel concept in American public life. Ronald Reagan had taken the same route on a grander scale. But Sonny brought to the role a particular kind of pragmatic showmanship that owed more to his years as a producer and talent manager than to any deep ideological conviction. He served in Congress for 2 terms. He was generally well liked by colleagues on both sides of the aisle, regarded as affable and approachable, if not especially influential in terms of policy. He supported copyright term extension, a cause that aligned neatly with the interests of someone who had spent his career managing intellectual property rights, and the resulting legislation. The Copyright Term Extension Act of 1998 was colloquially known as the Sonny Bono Act after his advocacy for it. The man who had structured his marriage around the control of creative output spent his final years in public life trying to extend the legal duration of that control for everyone in the entertainment industry. There is a symmetry in that fact that does not require commentary to be visible. On January 5th, 1998, Sonny Bono was skiing at the Heavenly Mountain Resort near South Lake Tahoe, California. It was a clear winter day. He was 62 years old, a sitting member of Congress, a former mayor, a former television star, a man who had lived several distinct lives and was in the middle of the latest one when he lost control on a ski run and struck a tree at high speed. He died at the scene. The death was sudden, accidental, and devastating in the specific way that unexpected deaths always are for the people left behind. There was no preparation, no hospital vigil, no opportunity for goodbye. One moment he was alive and skiing and thinking about whatever a 62-year-old man thinks about on a mountain in January, and the next moment he was not. The news reached Cher, and then it reached the rest of the country, and the reaction was an outpouring of the kind of public grief that Americans reserve for people to feel they know personally, people whose faces have been in their living rooms, people whose marriages they have watched and whose songs they have sung along to in their cars. Cher delivered the eulogy at his funeral, and it became one of the most watched and most discussed public tributes of the decade. A woman standing over the body of the man who had simultaneously discovered her, promoted her, controlled her, exploited her, and loved her in whatever limited way he was capable of, trying to articulate what he had meant to her when what he had meant defied any single word. She spoke of him with warmth. She spoke of him with humor. She did not pretend the relationship had been uncomplicated, but she also did not use the occasion to settle accounts. The eulogy was an act of generosity, or perhaps an act of acknowledgement that whatever Sonny had done, he had also been a person, a father, a colleague, and someone whose presence in her life, however damaging, had also been formative in ways she could not undo and did not entirely want to. One of the stranger chapters in the post-divorce story had been the professional reunion that preceded Sonny's death by several years. Despite everything, the financial coercion, the surveillance, the custody battle, the years of legal antagonism, Sonny and Cher had found their way back to performing together. They appeared on television talk shows. They reprised the banter. They sang "I Got You, Babe," as though the song's promise of loyalty had not been exposed as fiction by a decade of divorce proceedings and royalty disputes. The public responded with the enthusiasm of an audience that wanted desperately to believe the love story had been real, or at least that the two people at its center had made peace with what it had actually been. Cher later spoke about these reunions with a complexity that resisted neat categorization. She did not hate Sonny. She had never entirely stopped caring about him. She had also never stopped knowing what he had done and what it had cost her. The two truths coexisted, not resolved, but held in a balance that only people who have loved and been damaged by the same person can fully understand. Sonny's death turned him into a permanently unresolved figure in Cher's life. There would be no final reckoning. There would be no late night conversation in which everything was laid out and accounted for and either forgiven or not forgiven on honest terms. There would only be the conversations Cher later imagined, the things she wished she had said, and the understanding, available only to people who have lost someone they loved and resented in equal measure, that the absence of resolution is itself a kind of permanent inheritance. She would carry Sonny with her not as a settled memory, but as an open question. What would he have said if there had been more time? And would it have been enough? For Chaz, the aftermath was not fame's afterglow, but inheritance in the deeper sense. The slow, often painful accumulation of consequences from a childhood spent inside a machine that had not been designed with a child's needs in mind. Growing up as the child of Sonny and Cher meant growing up as public property. Every aspect of Chaz's development, physical, emotional, social, unfolded under a degree of scrutiny that most adults would find intolerable, let alone a child navigating the ordinary confusions of identity and belonging. The divorce intensified the scrutiny rather than relieving it, because now the public was not just watching a famous child, but watching a famous child move between two famous parents whose separation was itself a national news story. The struggle with identity, personal, sexual, and eventually gender identity, played out in this relentless glare. Chaz came out publicly as a lesbian in 1995, a decision that required courage in any context but demanded a particular kind of fortitude when your parents were among the most famous people in the country and the tabloid press treated your private life as entertainment content. The public response was mixed. The private response, the family response, was more complicated than any public statement could convey. Later, Chaz came out as transgender, underwent transition, and became a visible and vocal advocate for transgender rights and visibility, a trajectory that transformed a childhood defined by someone else's brand into an adulthood defined by hard-won self-determination. Chaz wrote books, Chaz appeared in documentaries, Chaz took acting roles. The work of becoming a separate person, separate from the mythology of Sonny and Cher, separate from the expectations attached to a famous name, separate from the public sense of ownership of someone they had watched grow up on television, was the work of decades, and it was not painless and it was not linear. But it was, by any honest measure, the most important project of Chaz's life, the construction of an identity that belonged to Chaz alone, after a childhood in which identity had been assigned by others and performed for cameras. The legal aftermath of the marriage extended far beyond the divorce itself and reached, with the tenacity of compound interest, deep into the 21st century. A 1978 marriage settlement agreement had given Cher 50% of certain composition and record royalties derived from songs Sonny had written before February 1st, 1974, or acquired before the couple's legal separation. The agreement was specific, it was legally binding, and it represented at the time the closest thing to justice that the legal system could offer a woman who had spent more than a decade generating wealth she had never been allowed to control. But the agreement was not the end of the story. After Sonny's death, his heirs inherited his estate, including his share of the royalty streams from the songs. And the question of whether Cher's contractual rights under the 1978 settlement survived subsequent changes in copyright law. Specifically, whether termination rights exercised by Sonny's heirs under the Copyright Act could override the divorce settlement's royalty provisions, became the subject of protracted litigation that stretched across years and generated the kind of legal fees that only make sense when the underlying assets are worth fighting over. In 2024, legal commentary and court decisions confirmed that Cher ultimately prevailed in this dispute, with the court reaffirming that her royalty rights under the marriage settlement survived the copyright maneuvers attempted by Sonny's estate. The ruling was significant not only for Cher, but for the broader legal principle it established that a contractual right to royalties bargained for in a divorce settlement could not be erased by the unilateral exercise of statutory termination rights by the other party's heirs. The royalty fight matters to this story because it proves, with the clarity of legal documents and court opinions, that the financial architecture of the Sonny and Cher marriage did not stay in the past. It kept reaching forward decade after decade, long after the marriage was over and one of its principals was dead. The songs that had made them famous, I Got You Babe, and the others, continued to generate money, and the money continued to be fought over, and the fight continued to turn on the same question that had defined the marriage itself. Who owned what, and whether the woman whose talent had made the enterprise valuable was entitled to a fair share of what it produced. Cher is 79 years old. She is still publicly active, still performing, still recording, still showing up, still present in the cultural landscape in a way that defies every conventional expectation about how entertainment careers end. In May of 2026, she attended the Met Gala in New York, nearly 6 decades after I Got You Babe, first played on the radio, and the image of her on the red carpet, older, undeniable, still entirely herself, served as a quiet refutation of everything the marriage had tried to make her believe about her own dependence. Chaz is 57. In March of 2026, Chaz married Shara Blue Matthews at the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel in Los Angeles, with Cher in attendance. The wedding was a private affair by the standards of celebrity events, deliberately kept small and intimate, and its significance lay not in its glamour, but in its ordinariness. A person who had spent a lifetime navigating public exposure, identity struggle, and the inheritance of a famous name, choosing to build a life organized around love rather than performance. Sonny is gone. He has been gone for 28 years, but he is not narratively gone. He survives in archive footage that still circulates on the internet, in songs that still play on the radio and on streaming platforms, in court documents that still generate legal fees, in the memory of a political career that ended on a ski slope, and in the unresolved questions that Cher still carries about what he took and why he took it, and whether, in the end, he understood what it had cost. This story is not really about a celebrity divorce. It is about what happens when a marriage becomes a corporation before the people inside it understand the terms. The public saw wit and glamour and a duet that promised loyalty in 3 words. Behind the name was a structure built on talent, dependence, control, and the long confusion between being loved and being managed. The woman got out, the man remade himself, and then died before the final conversation could happen. The child grew up and built a life that the original script never anticipated. And the contract and the royalties, the ownership claims, the legal architecture of who owed what to whom, kept echoing for decades, proof that the private history of a famous marriage never really stops generating consequences. There is no neat moral to any of that. There's only the fact that a woman who was once unable to explain how she was paid is now, at 79, the sole author of her own life. The cost of arriving there was paid first at home, in the years when home and the stage were the same place, and the price was higher than the public ever knew.